There is a moment, quiet, unremarkable on the surface, when a person's cruelty becomes the very instrument of their own undoing. They don't see it happening. That is the particular tragedy of arrogance. It blinds you to the exact moment you are handing someone else the key to your own defeat, places the tool of your undoing directly into the hands of the person you most underestimated, and asks you to smile while you do it. This is the story of Marcus Webb, an architectural consultant who spent 3 years being told, in 100 different ways and through 100 different gestures of dismissal, that he was not enough, not wealthy enough, not impressive enough, not the right kind of successful for the circles he was trying to occupy. And on the night that was supposed to belong entirely to someone else, a retirement celebration for a man who had built an empire from nothing, from 2 drafting tables and a borrowed telephone in a back office on Clement Street, Marcus sat near the perimeter of a well-appointed room in a borrowed blazer. Nursing a glass of water he had refilled twice because it gave his hands something to do, while the woman who had once claimed to love him stood 40 feet away near a marble fireplace and laughed at everything he had quietly, methodically, and without any fanfare whatsoever become. She laughed a little too early. She laughed without first checking her facts. And that laugh, sharp, performative, calibrated to impress the specific people standing in her immediate radius, would cost her more than she could have imagined when she opened her mouth. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, someone who stood close enough to see the truth and chose the easier story instead, stay with this one. Because what happened next is worth every single minute of your attention. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, stories about dignity and patience and the kind of justice that arrives precisely on schedule, do one thing right now and hit that like button, and make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Drop your location in the comments below. It genuinely matters to know who is watching and where. Now, let's get all the way into it. Marcus Webb was 34 years old when his engagement to Celeste Hargrove ended, and the most remarkable thing about the ending was its complete absence of drama. That was the detail that stayed with him afterward, not the words she used, not the expression on her face, not even the specific evening itself, but the silence around the whole thing, the lack of theater, no screaming, no thrown objects. No door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame and give the neighbors something to remember. Celeste had simply looked at him one evening across the granite kitchen counter of the apartment they had shared in the east side of the city for 2 years, and she had said, with the practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed their words more than once and found the version that creates the least resistance, that she didn't see the relationship going where she needed it to go. He had asked her what she meant. He remembered keeping his voice level, leaning both hands flat on the counter, giving her the space to say what she had already decided to say. She had taken a breath before she answered, and in the architecture of that breath lived an entire cathedral of things she had never bothered to say out loud across the full 2 years they had been together. Every reservation she had swallowed and dressed up as patience. Every quiet comparison she had drawn between Marcus and the men her father introduced at firm events. Every time she had looked at his car in the parking garage, or his jacket on the hook and filed it away as evidence for a conclusion she was already building. When she finally exhaled, what came out was this: I need someone who is building something, Marcus. Something real and visible. I don't think what you're doing qualifies. What Marcus was doing at that precise point in time was operating a boutique architectural consulting practice out of a converted studio in the warehouse district, 4 blocks from the river. He had 3 paying clients, a reputation within his small professional orbit for meticulous and unusually thorough detail work on commercial renovation projects, and a personal savings discipline that bordered on the monastic. He drove a 5-year-old dark gray sedan that he kept immaculately clean. He wore good clothes that did not announce themselves. He ate lunch at his desk most days, usually something he had packed that morning, and he spent his evenings doing something that Celeste knew nothing about. Because he had never seen a reason to tell her, he was analyzing acquisition reports and asset valuations for commercial properties that he was, in an orderly and entirely unhurried manner, beginning to purchase through a holding company registered under a name that bore no connection to his own. None of this was visible from Celeste's vantage point. She saw the studio, the sedan, the unremarkable jacket. She ran her assessment from those data points. And to her credit, or perhaps, depending on how one measures such things, to her eternal disadvantage, she had never once thought to look beneath the surface she was reading. He moved out of the apartment within 7 days of that conversation. He was examining the feeling, honestly more relieved than he had expected to be. The relationship had been a slow and steady erosion of the energy he needed for other things, not catastrophically, not cruelly, but persistently, the way water works on stone over time. The return on emotional investment had been declining for longer than he had acknowledged, and the breakup was, in some sense, the market correcting itself. He had stayed 2 years longer than the relationship warranted because he had genuinely loved her, or something close enough to love that the distinction felt academic. But love without respect is something else entirely. It is habit and proximity, and the fear of the logistics of separation and habits can be broken cleanly if you have the discipline to actually let go rather than simply loosen your grip. Marcus let go. He signed the lease on the studio space in the warehouse district. He went back to work. The 18 months that followed were, without question, the most productive of Marcus Webb's professional life to that point. He landed a significant commercial renovation contract with a regional hotel group looking to reposition 3 mid-market properties. That contract introduced him to a medical office developer who had been watching the hotel project's progress and liked what he observed. The medical developer introduced him, through a referral that Marcus had not sought but received, with genuine gratitude, to the project manager at a regional institutional architecture firm who would become one of his most important professional relationships. And that project manager, a careful, observant woman named Helen Park, who had been in the commercial architecture space for 2 decades, was the person who called Marcus on a Tuesday morning, 14 months after his engagement ended, and told him there was a consulting engagement he needed to know about. The firm was Hargrove Architectural Partners, Edmund Hargrove's firm, Celeste's father. Marcus sat with that information for approximately 45 seconds before he accepted the irony, set it aside, and asked Helen to tell him more about the scope of work. He was hired not through any residual connection to Celeste. He had not spoken to her since the breakup, had not attempted to, and had no particular interest in doing so, but entirely on the strength of Helen Park's referral and the hotel group's documentation of his work. Edmund Hargrove, as Marcus would come to understand, hired based on evidence. He was not a man who trafficked in sentiment when it came to professional decisions. Edmund Hargrove turned out to be precisely the kind of man Marcus found himself immediately respecting. He had built his firm over 31 years from a 2-person drafting office on Clement Street into a 14-member practice with a solid regional reputation for institutional and commercial architecture. He was exacting and precise in his professional standards in a way that never tipped into cruelty. He paid his consultants on the agreed schedule, which Marcus noted because it was not universal. He gave credit where credit was owed, which was also not universal. He communicated expectations clearly, received difficult information without shooting the messenger, and had never, in the entire 4 months of Marcus's consulting engagement with the firm, made a single reference to his daughter or to any personal history between them. If Edmund was aware that Marcus had once been engaged to Celeste, he carried that knowledge with complete professional discretion. Marcus completed the consulting engagement on schedule. The work was thorough, well documented, and incorporated several recommendations that Edmund had not asked for but that addressed structural vulnerabilities in two of the firm's largest ongoing projects. Edmund reviewed the final deliverable in silence for a long time. When he looked up, he said, "You think the way a good architect thinks. You see the load-bearing walls before you see anything else. Most people only ever see the surfaces." He said nothing else. He did not need to. Marcus filed those words in the place where he kept the things that mattered. It was 8 weeks after that consulting engagement concluded that Marcus learned, through the professional intelligence network he had spent years carefully cultivating, that Edmund Hargrove was seriously preparing to retire. The man was 67 years old. He had operated the firm for 31 years at a level of personal investment that had taken a physical toll, which Edmund acknowledged to no one directly, but which was legible to anyone paying attention. He had no family successor position to step into leadership. Celeste had gone into wealth management, not architecture, and had shown no interest in the firm's operations. According to two separate and reliable sources, Edmund had been quietly and methodically exploring options for a structured acquisition by a buyer who would preserve the culture he had built, retain the people who had built it with him, and continue the firm's work without dismantling what 31 years of disciplined effort had created. Marcus took 48 hours to decide whether to pursue it. Then he spent 4 days doing the serious work. He engaged the commercial attorney he had used for his 3 previous acquisitions and a financial analyst he had worked with twice before. Together, they reviewed the firm's full project portfolio, its existing and pipeline client relationships, its staff composition and compensation structure, its current contracts and their expiration schedule, its liability profile, and its physical assets. At the end of those 4 days, Marcus had a complete picture of what the firm was worth, what it would cost to run it well, what it would require from him in terms of attention and leadership, and what the realistic return on that investment looked like over a 5-year horizon. The picture was favorable. More than favorable. It was the kind of opportunity that appears once if you have done the work to recognize it. He made an offer through his holding company. It was a clean offer, fully financed, without contingencies, priced at a valuation that was fair to Edmund rather than opportunistic, structured with a retention commitment for all 14 existing staff members, and conditioned on the preservation of the Hargrove Architectural Partners name for a minimum of 5 years following the acquisition date. The last condition had been Marcus's idea. It was not required. He had included it because it was the right thing to include. Edmund Hargrove accepted the offer without a counter-proposal. His attorney reviewed the terms and confirmed they were straightforward. The due diligence period ran 6 weeks, during which Marcus's team examined everything with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to every decision. Nothing unexpected surfaced. The papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in a conference room at the firm's offices that smelled of old drafting linen and fresh coffee. And when the last signature was in place, Edmund stood up and shook Marcus's hand with both of his own, and held it for a moment longer than a purely transactional gesture would have required. "I'm glad it's you," he said. "Of all the outcomes I considered, this is the one I hoped for." The acquisition was not at that point public knowledge. Marcus had requested a 60-day quiet period before any formal announcement for reasons that were purely operational. He wanted to meet individually with every member of the staff before anything was disclosed more broadly. He wanted the transition plan fully documented and reviewed before existing clients were notified. And he wanted to ensure that the news, when it came in a form that created confidence rather than uncertainty. Edmund had agreed to the quiet period immediately. He was, in this as in most things, a man who understood the value of doing something properly, rather than quickly. The retirement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the papers were signed. Edmund's wife, Barbara, had organized it at the family home in Whitmore, a large, gracious house on a quiet street that had hosted firm gatherings for decades, and carried within its rooms the particular warmth of a space that had absorbed a great many good evenings. The invitation list covered 30 years of professional relationships, colleagues and collaborators, long-standing clients, people from the wider architectural community who had known Edmund when the firm was 2 people and a borrowed telephone. It was a genuine celebration, not a performance of one. Edmund had personally asked Marcus to attend. He had made the request in the same direct, unceremonious way he made most requests: a brief message, a clear invitation, an expression of genuine preference rather than social obligation. Marcus accepted because Edmund had asked, because refusing would have been both ungracious and somewhat strange given the nature of what now connected them professionally, and because he had liked Edmund Hargrove from almost the first hour he spent working with him. Marcus did not own formal evening wear. He owned well-maintained work clothes and 2 blazers, and he selected the dark navy one, which was well cut and said nothing particular about him in either direction. He drove himself to Whitmore in the 5-year-old sedan. He found a parking space on the street half a block from the house. He arrived at the time the invitation specified, neither conspicuously early nor late enough to suggest reluctance. He located Edmund within the first 10 minutes, offered his congratulations in a few genuine sentences, and then moved to find a quiet position near the perimeter of the main reception room. 2. A spot where he could observe the evening's architecture without being drawn into conversations he had not come to have and could not have with any real honesty until the announcement was made. He saw Celeste within 20 minutes of arriving. She was positioned near the fireplace on the far wall, the social center of the room, as she had always instinctively understood it would be, and she was animated in the specific way Marcus remembered from every party they had attended together. She had always known how to hold a room's attention without appearing to reach for it, how to be the bright point in a gathering without the effort being visible. It was a genuine skill, and he had always acknowledged it honestly. She was standing with 2 women he did not recognize, and a man in a well-tailored gray suit who had the smooth, slightly aggressive posture of someone whose entire professional identity is organized around the impression he makes on other people. Celeste was in her element, her father's house, her father's friends, her father's 30-year professional world, a context in which her position was established and entirely secure. She spotted Marcus across the room. He watched the recognition move across her face in real time. A flicker of genuine surprise, followed almost immediately by something more deliberate. The rapid social calculation that runs in the background when you encounter someone from a previous chapter of your life and must decide within 2 seconds how to frame them for the audience currently assembled around you. Marcus recognized the calculation. He had watched her run it on other people for 2 years. He raised his glass slightly. He did not walk over. She walked over to him. That was the first miscalculation of the evening, though she couldn't have known it yet. Marcus? Her voice was warm the way a well-appointed hotel lobby is warm, carefully engineered, pleasant enough, but the temperature stops at the surface. I didn't realize you would be here. Edmund invited me, Marcus said. Simply, factually, without elaboration. She tilted her head. The familiar gesture that had always meant she was deciding how much to probe a situation. You 2 know each other. We've worked together. He's a remarkable man. Something adjusted at the edges of her expression. Not quite displeasure, not quite genuine curiosity, a recalibration of categories. The social equivalent of checking a figure that has come out differently than expected. Of course, she said. Dad has always collected interesting people. The word interesting was placed with the care of a person who knows it functions as a compliment in one register and a diminishment in another, and is content to let the ambiguity do its work. They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. The conversation was conducted entirely at the surface level, the kind of exchange that performs the social function of acknowledgement without requiring any actual communication. She mentioned her current position at a wealth management firm, deploying the name with the particular casual fluency of someone who has learned exactly which names open certain doors and has practiced saying them in a way that sounds accidental. He listened. He offered nothing substantive about his own work. He said nothing that invited comparison, nothing that created an opening, nothing that required her to update the story she was telling about him to the people she would return to in a few minutes. At the end of those 4 minutes, the man in the gray suit materialized at her shoulder with the timing of someone who has been watching from a few feet away and decided the moment was right to rejoin the conversation. She turned to make the introduction, and in the turning was a gesture so practiced it was almost art, a slight repositioning of her body that placed Marcus at the edge of the social frame rather than its center and introduced him in the direction of the gray suit without quite looking at him directly. "Darren," she said, with the warmth she reserved for people who occupied the correct tier. "This is Marcus. We dated a while back." A pause followed. It was not a pause of confusion or of genuine difficulty with recall. It was a performance of difficulty, a theatrical half-second of apparent effort designed to convey that what came next occupied a category too minor to have retained with precision. "He does consulting work, something in architecture." Darren extended his hand. His handshake was the kind that carries information, grip, duration, and the angle of approach, all communicating a considered position on the hierarchy of the current interaction. "What kind of consulting?" he asked, in the tone of someone who poses questions not to receive answers, but to establish who is doing the explaining and who is doing the assessing. "Project analysis, acquisition strategy," Marcus said. "Commercial architecture space." Darren produced a nod, the specific variety of nod that a person deploys when they have already decided the answer is beneath their register of serious interest. But social form requires a response. "Good for you," he said, with the two-word efficiency of a man who has calibrated his encouragement to be just sufficient and no more. He turned back to Celeste. Marcus returned to his position near the wall. He sipped his water. He looked out at the room with the unhurried attention of someone who is not performing composure, but actually experiencing it. He was not angry. Over the preceding 18 months, he had learned, through practice rather than philosophy, that anger is expensive and patience is not, and that the difference between the returns they generate, measured across any meaningful time horizon, is extraordinary. He looked at the room. He thought about the transition plan meeting scheduled for Monday morning. He thought about a question Patricia Chen had sent to his assistant about the operational review timeline. He watched Edmund move through the gathering with the unhurried attention of a man who has nothing left to prove and every reason to be fully present. The real moment arrived 40 minutes later. Edmund had been making his way around the room in the methodical, genuine way of a person who has decided to actually attend his own retirement party rather than simply host it, stopping at each cluster of guests for enough time to have a real exchange, asking questions and actually listening to the answers, giving each person the specific and undivided attention that had made him, over 31 years, the kind of professional who inspired genuine loyalty rather than mere compliance. When he approached, the group assembled near the fireplace. There was a natural elevation of the energy around him, a warmth directed at him that was clearly not performed, the authentic version of the thing people sometimes pretend to feel. Marcus was approximately 15 feet away, close enough to hear the conversation at a normal volume. He watched Edmund embrace his daughter with the comfortable ease of a father who knows his child well. He watched Edmund exchange a few words with Darren in the politely interested manner of a man who meets many people at parties and is gracious to all of them. He watched Edmund accept the congratulations of the two women with the slightly self-conscious pleasure of someone who is not entirely accustomed to being the occasion. And then Edmund turned. He scanned the room in a single practice sweep. He found Marcus. What followed was not an accident of proximity, not the social drift of two people happening to occupy adjacent space. It was a deliberate movement, visible as such to everyone in the vicinity. A man crossing a specific distance with a specific purpose, the way people move when they are going towards something they have actually chosen. Edmund reached Marcus, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said in a voice entirely calibrated to carry, "There he is, Marcus. I have been looking for you for half an hour. Barbara wants to make absolutely sure you have everything you need this evening. You are one of the most important guests in this house tonight, and I will not have you standing in the corner like you don't belong here." The silence that followed those two sentences occupied perhaps 3 seconds. In terms of social weight, it was considerably longer. Celeste's expression underwent a rapid and visible revision. The two women looked at each other with the brief, communicative glance of people processing new information in real time. Darren's jaw made a small, involuntary adjustment, the kind a person makes when a calculation has returned a number they were not expecting. Edmund, who had spent 31 years reading rooms professionally and personally, who had built a firm and a family and a reputation on the consistent, accurate assessment of what was actually happening in any given space. Edmund continued speaking, with the ease of a man who has decided exactly what he wants to say and has no uncertainty about saying it. "I want to make sure you have a chance to meet a few people while you're here. The senior partners from Breyer and Whitfield are somewhere in the back rooms. They're going to be working closely with the new ownership over the next 12 months, and you should have a proper introduction before all of that gets underway." The word ownership dropped into the room with the quiet, irreversible weight of a fact. Celeste said, with a lightness that was clearly working harder than lightness should have to work, "Dad, what announcement? What new ownership?" Edmund turned to look at his daughter with the open, uncomplicated affection of a father, who was also at this precise moment entirely aware of the multiple things simultaneously occurring in the room around him. "The firm," he said simply. "I found the right person to take it over. Everything has been settled for a few weeks now. We're waiting on the formal announcement to go out, but half the people in this room are going to know in 2 weeks, regardless." He looked at Marcus. There was a question in the look, a genuine one, not theatrical, asking how much Marcus wanted, said, and when. Marcus considered for a moment. The quiet period was a logistical preference, not a strict requirement. The staff meetings were scheduled. The transition plan was ready. "It's your evening, Edmund," he said. "Whatever serves you best." Edmund smiled. The full smile, the one that reached his eyes and carried no performance in it. Marcus acquired the firm, he said to the assembled group near the fireplace, in exactly the same conversational register he would use to share any other pleasant development among friends. "Hargrove, Architectural Partners, will keep its name, keep every member of its staff, and keep doing the work it has always done. I could not have found a better outcome, and believe me, I looked carefully for the better part of 2 years before I found it." This silence was longer than the previous one. It had more content in it. Darren broke it first, because men, like Darren, are profoundly uncomfortable with silences that destabilize the architecture of a situation. And this silence was doing exactly that to the architecture he had walked into this conversation with. "The whole firm," he said, and the question was directed toward Marcus with a quality of attention that was physically different from the quality he had deployed. 45 minutes earlier, the eyes slightly wider, the posture minutely adjusted, the tone recalibrated on the fly. "The entire practice?" "The entire practice," Marcus confirmed, pleasantly, without emphasis, without the performance of modesty and without the performance of triumph, simply as a statement of a thing that was factually the case. Celeste said nothing. She was looking at her father first, then at Marcus, then at a point in the middle distance that appeared to contain a very rapid and very thorough re-examination of the past 2 hours. The social warmth had left her face entirely. What replaced it was something more honest, something that might have been the beginning of a genuine reckoning if given the space to develop, but this was not the space, and this was not the moment for that, and she knew it. Marcus did not hold her expression in his attention. He turned to Edmund and said, You mentioned Barbara wanted to find me. Let's go. Make sure she has everything she needs." And he walked with Edmund Hargrove across the length of the main reception room in a direction that was away from the fireplace, and away from Celeste, and away from Darren, and away from the careful, meticulous social structure that had been constructed around his diminishment, and he did not look back. Not as a statement, not as a gesture, simply because there was nothing in that direction that required his attention any further. The evening continued the way these evenings do. The world does not pause its rotation to acknowledge a person's moment of reckoning, and Marcus had no interest in it doing so. The caterers continued their circuits of the room with trays of things that gleamed under the warm amber light of the house. The conversations rose and fell in the ordinary music of a gathering that is genuinely celebratory rather than obligatory. The fire in the fireplace maintained its slow, indifferent burn. Edmund made his formal remarks at 8:30. He stood near the center of the room without a microphone, because the room was the right size, and Edmund was the kind of man whose voice carries when he decides it should. And he spoke for perhaps 12 minutes about the professional life he was completing and the things he had learned from it. He spoke about the particular privilege of work that means something, about the colleagues who had stayed and the ones who had moved on, and what both categories had taught him, about the difference between building something and merely occupying it. When he mentioned the acquisition, a single paragraph toward the end of his remarks, clear and factual and warm, he described it as having been handled with integrity, and he said that was the quality he had been searching for above all others, and that, finding it in a person he had worked with directly, had made the decision both easier and more meaningful. He named Marcus without theatrics, the way he named everything, precisely, with appropriate weight, without embellishment. There was a murmur through the room, not shock, exactly, more a collective recalibration, the social adjustment that happens when a significant piece of information reorganizes the relationships between the people in a given space. Several people glanced toward Marcus. In the minutes following Edmund's remarks, a number of them made their way to find him. The senior partners from Breyer and Whitfield located him near the window on the east side of the room and introduced themselves with the calibrated warmth of experienced professionals who understand the value of beginning a new working relationship on exactly the right footing. He spent 15 minutes with them and came away with a clear sense of what the first collaborative project would be and a genuine confidence that the working dynamic would be productive. Patricia Chen found him near the coffee service at the side table during a quieter interval of the evening. She was a compact, precise woman who Marcus had come to understand through 4 months of project reports, and one brief direct interaction was probably the most operationally capable person in the firm. She introduced herself without preamble, looked at him directly, and said, "I heard what Mr. Hargrove said. I want you to know the team is strong. We want this transition to work, and we are prepared to put in whatever it takes to make sure it does." Marcus told her he knew the team was strong, that he had reviewed every project report she had filed over the preceding 3 years, and that she was one of the 3 specific individuals whose presence in the firm had been a significant factor in his decision to move forward with the acquisition. She received that information with a quiet, measured stillness that told him exactly what she was made of. Not false modesty, not performance, just the settled acknowledgement of a professional who knows her own value and doesn't need the confirmation to be louder than it needs to be. He did not encounter Celeste again until he was preparing to leave. An hour and 20 minutes later, she found him in the entrance hall, retrieving his jacket from the coat room, slightly separated from the remaining guests. The party had thinned to perhaps a third of its earlier size, and the particular intimacy of a gathering's final hour had settled over the house. She had shed everything by then. The performance, the social brightness, the fluent ease that was her natural register in rooms like this one. What stood in front of him was simply a woman who had made a serious miscalculation, who understood clearly that she had made it, and who had not yet arrived at what she wanted to do with that understanding. "Marcus," she said. Her voice had lost its earlier finish. It was quiet, and it was plain, and it was more interesting to him for being both. He turned and waited. He did not help her with what came next. "I didn't know," she said. The words were not precisely an apology. They lacked the full structure of one, the acknowledgement of harm, and the expression of regret. But they were the closest she could manage tonight, in this hallway, with this much new information still settling into place. "I know you didn't," he said. There was nothing in his voice, except the simple truth of the statement. He was not being generous, and he was not being cold. He was being accurate. She looked at him for a moment. A real look, the kind she hadn't given him in years, or, possibly, ever. "You could have told me," she said, "earlier in the evening, when we were talking by the drinks." He considered that seriously, the way he considered everything. "Why?" he asked, not as a rhetorical challenge, as a genuine inquiry into what her reasoning was. She didn't have an answer she could say out loud. Or perhaps the answer she had was the honest one. "Because I was unkind without cause, and a warning would have been a mercy I hadn't earned, and some part of me already knew I hadn't earned it." And that answer was more than she could offer in a hallway at the end of her father's retirement party. "You've built something real," she said finally. She said it carefully, the way people say things that have cost them something to arrive at. "I have," he said. "I have been building it for a long time." He said it without pride and without reproach, simply as a statement of fact about a life that had been proceeding on its own terms, regardless of whether anyone was observing it from the right angle. She nodded. The nod contained several things: acknowledgement and a kind of grief for the specific failure of imagination that had led her to this hallway and this conversation. She appeared on the verge of something further, and then she didn't say it. She turned and walked back toward the sound of the remaining party. Marcus put on his jacket. He found Barbara Hargrove at the front door and thanked her with genuine warmth for the evening. Barbara pressed his hand between both of hers and said that Edmund had slept better in the weeks since the signing than he had in years, and that she was profoundly relieved. The firm was going to someone who understood what it had cost to build it. Marcus said he did understand, and that he intended to honor that. He meant both sentences. Edmund walked him to the front step. They stood for a moment in the cooling night air of the Whitmore Street, looking at the row of quiet houses, the yellow lights in windows, the ordinary evening proceeding all around them. Edmund didn't say much. He didn't need to. He said good night. He said thank you, not just for the business, but for being present tonight, and that it had meant something. Marcus shook his hand and walked to his car. The drive back to the city took 22 minutes. The sedan was still 5 years old. The warehouse studio was still his office. His phone produced 3 new messages during the drive, 2 from contacts at the party requesting follow-up meetings, and 1 from his attorney confirming a minor administrative detail in the transition filing. He read all 3 at a red light, filed them mentally, and set the phone face down in the center console. He sat in the parking garage beneath the warehouse for a few minutes before going up. The engine cooled with the small, ticking sounds of warm metal contracting in cool air. He thought about the evening with the same unhurried attention he gave most things. He thought about what Celeste had said in the hallway, "You could have told me." He thought about the 2 years they had spent in the East Side apartment and the years since, and the distance between what he had been when she left and what he had assembled since. He had not planned the evening at Edmund's party. He had not positioned himself for a confrontation. He had not engineered the moment near the fireplace, or stage-managed Edmund's remarks, or orchestrated any element of the evening beyond accepting an invitation from a man he respected. He had simply shown up in the life he had built, doing the work that life required, and the moment had arrived on its own timeline and in its own form. That, he understood with some clarity, was what patience actually was, not passivity. Not waiting for someone to fail so that you could be positioned to witness it. Not nursing an old grievance through the long months of accumulation. Patience was the full, daily, committed act of building your life so thoroughly and so honestly, with so little attention paid to who was watching or what they were concluding, that when the collision finally came, and it always came in one form or another, you were simply, undeniably, already there. You had been there for a long time. The only thing that had changed was that someone was finally looking at the right angle. He had not needed Celeste Hargrove to witness it. He had not needed Darren of the gray suit, or the two women near the fireplace, or the assembled social jury that convenes itself automatically at every gathering where status is legible and visible and can be ranked and reported on. He had never needed the validation of people who were reading only what he chose to make visible. The invisible work, the acquisition reports reviewed at 10 o'clock at night, the holding company filings, the patient accumulation of properties under a name no one connected to his face, had not been invisible as a strategy. It had been invisible because it was work, and work does not perform. It simply continues. But if Marcus was honest with himself, and it was perhaps the discipline he was most consistent about. There was something in the evening that had settled an account he had not known was still open, not vengeance. He had no appetite for vengeance, which had always struck him as a transaction where you pay full price for something you already own, something quieter, the correction of a record that had been entered incorrectly. A verdict delivered without sufficient information, marked as final, and now, without drama or ceremony, revised. She had called it not quite real. She had looked at a man who was quietly assembling something significant and read the visible surface and made her determination. The invisible had been present the entire time. It simply had not been performing for her. In the weeks that followed the party, Marcus moved through the transition with the same methodical care he brought to every significant undertaking. He held individual meetings with each of the 14 staff members at Hargrove Architectural Partners over the course of 10 days, scheduling them in the conference room that smelled of old drafting linen and making sure each meeting had enough time built into it to be a real conversation rather than an administrative formality. He listened considerably more than he spoke. He asked each person about their current project responsibilities, about what was functioning well operationally, about what was creating friction, and about what they needed from new leadership to feel confident in the transition. He took notes by hand. He reviewed those notes each evening. Patterns emerged that confirmed several of his assessments and surfaced 2 issues he had not anticipated, both of which he addressed before the formal announcement went out. Patricia Chin's meeting ran 45 minutes longer than scheduled. She arrived with a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten observations, organized under 3 headings: current priorities, structural concerns, and opportunities. And she presented them with the precision of someone who has been waiting for the right audience for a while. By the end of the conversation, she was the firm's new operations director. The offer was a direct extension of what Marcus had observed. The title and the compensation matched what the role was already doing in practice, and the formalization was simply honesty applied to an org chart. She accepted it with the same quiet, settled acknowledgement she had shown him at the party. The formal announcement went out 37 days after the party, a single-page document, clean prose, no superlatives. It named the acquiring entity, confirmed the staff retention and name preservation commitments, outlined the operational continuity plan for current projects, and included a brief statement from Edmund expressing his confidence in the outcome. The architectural and commercial development community received it with the measured approval of people who follow these transitions carefully and can distinguish between an acquisition built to preserve something and one built to extract value and move on. Several of Edmund's longest-standing client relationships reached out to Marcus directly in the first week, wanting to establish continuity in a personal way before their project contacts were formally transferred. He met with each of them. He listened carefully. He brought Patricia Chen to 3 of the meetings, which she navigated with the easy authority of someone who had been managing these relationships quietly for years and was simply now doing so with the right title. He did not seek out Celeste. He had no interest in further contact, not from coldness. The conversation in the hallway had been honest and therefore complete, but because there was genuinely nothing left in that direction requiring his attention. The matter had resolved itself in the manner that honest things eventually resolve, not through confrontation, but through the slow, steady arrival of accurate information into the space where inaccurate information had been living. The postscript arrived approximately 6 weeks after the formal announcement through a professional networking platform in the form of a message from Darren. It ran 3 sentences. It opened by acknowledging that they had briefly crossed paths at Edmund Hargrove's retirement celebration, a description so smooth and so entirely absent of any acknowledgement of what had actually transpired between them that Marcus spent a moment genuinely appreciating the audacity of it. The second sentence noted that Darren's firm managed relationships with several commercial development clients who were actively evaluating new architectural consulting partnerships. The third sentence asked whether Marcus might be open to an initial conversation. Marcus read the message twice. He thought about those 3 sentences. The professional lacquer laid over the evening with the thoroughness of a skilled Finnish carpenter, leaving no trace of the original grain. Then he forwarded the message to Patricia Chen with a single line, "Your call." If the underlying client relationships are substantive, the prior personal dynamics are irrelevant to business. She replied within 40 minutes. She had already located background on 2 of the commercial developers Darren represented. The projects were genuine, the clients were established, and both development pipelines fit within the firm's existing capacity and competency range. She recommended an initial call, contingent on standard client evaluation criteria, with no special weight assigned to the introduction source. Marcus replied to Darren with a brief, entirely professional note. A 30-minute call, following Thursday, with himself and his operations director. Forward-looking, businesslike, and entirely free of the satisfaction he felt, which was real and which belonged to him privately, in the same folder where he kept the things that did not require an audience. Edmund Hargrove sent a note 3 weeks after the announcement, handwritten on the firm's letterhead. The old version, the one with the original Clement Street address in the footer, which Edmund had apparently kept a supply of. It said that he had heard from 3 former long-standing clients, all of whom had expressed confidence in the transition and their intention to continue their relationships with the firm. It said that he was sleeping better than he had in years, and that Barbara was making pointed comments about the quantity of time he was spending in the garden, which he was taking as a positive sign. It ended, relieved beyond measure, and certain we made the right choice. E.H. Marcus printed it. He kept it in the small leather folder on his desk, where he stored the few documents that held personal significance distinct from their professional content. The folder was not large. It contained the original signed contract from his consulting practice's first client engagement, roughly 4 years before the party, when the entire enterprise had been 1 person and 1 client, and a single drafting table borrowed from a friend who asked no questions. It now also contained Edmund's note. Those 2 pieces of paper formed a private narrative that required no further documentation and no external witness, the beginning of a thing, and the confirmation that the thing had been fully and properly built. He understood what both of them meant without anyone's help. There is a particular kind of person who moves through the world with a scale. They constructed it themselves over years, from the materials available to them. The suburb they grew up in, the schools they attended, the professional environments where their values were formed and reinforced. The scale measures wealth and title and the visible markers of success. The address, the car, the firm's name on the business card, the ease with which certain names are recognized when deployed in the right company. These measurements feel to the people making them like intelligence, like accurate reading, like discernment. They are confident in this skill. It returns consistent results, and the people around them reward it. But the scale is measuring the visible, and the visible is always, at best, half the information. Marcus Webb understood this, not because he was a philosopher or because he had arrived at the insight through careful, deliberate reasoning. He understood it because he had spent 2 years being measured by a scale that was reading only the half of his life he had chosen not to display. He had learned through that experience and the 18 months that followed it that the invisible work, the patient accumulation made in unglamorous conference rooms, the acquisition filings under a company name no one connected to his face. The Tuesday mornings reviewing asset reports at a borrowed drafting table while other people were at parties was the work that actually built things. It did not announce itself. It did not require observation. It simply compounded and then compounded again, and then one evening in a house on a quiet street in Whitmore, a man who had built something over 31 years crossed a room full of people to stand beside you, and the invisible work became for one brief and clarifying moment visible to the people who had been looking at only half the picture. That moment was not for Celeste. It was not for Darren or the women by the fireplace or any member of the assembled social jury. It was for Marcus in the same way that every day of the preceding 3 years had been for Marcus, the only audience that had ever actually been present for the work and the only one whose assessment had ever required satisfaction. He drove home in his 5-year-old sedan. He read his messages. He went to sleep. The next morning, the work continued as it had every morning before it, and as it would every morning after. Here's the question this story keeps asking, underneath everything else. How often do we assign the wrong value to something because we are reading only its surface? How often does our certainty about our own assessments prevent us from asking whether the scale itself might be miscalibrated? Celeste did not manufacture cruelty from nowhere. She had a value system. She had applied it consistently, and within that system, she was being entirely logical. The problem was not her reasoning. The problem was the premises she had never examined closely enough to question. She had been reading the visible and calling it the full picture, and the full picture had been there the entire time, proceeding on its own terms, requiring nothing from her attention. The people who are building real things quietly are everywhere. They are in the room with you right now, in whatever form that room takes. They are sitting at the tables where no one thought to save them a seat. They are not performing their work for an audience, and they are not waiting for permission to continue. They are measuring nothing about you except whether you are honest and whether the work between you is worth doing together. Be one of those people. Build the thing that matters to you. Build it with your whole attention and without requiring anyone's acknowledgement of the building. Build it on the days when no one is watching, which is most days, and on the days when someone finally looks and sees it clearly. You will not need them to tell you what it is worth. You will already know. You have known for a long time. If this story reached something real in you, if it stirred something about patience or dignity, or the long and quiet satisfaction of a game played honestly and well, share it today with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, because it matters and because this is a community that is worth knowing about. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because there are more stories like this one on the way, and every single one of them is worth your full attention. We will see you in the next one.